And we are live once again. It is the Fantasy Football Forum. We are done now with the Week 8 slate of NFL. Now we are officially over halfway through the NFL season for the regular season, more than halfway through for fantasy football seasons for those that are listening, playing fantasy football. We're on to Week 9. I'm joined once again by my co-host Grant. Grant, a belated happy Halloween week, or I guess maybe that was last week, but we are now headed into November where it is officially now time for teams to start making their way of they're either the good are rising to the top of the league and the bad are starting to get shown where it is easier to put forth wins come September and everybody's fresh. Now we are kind of getting into the dog days of winter and NFL season. So, Grant, how are you doing now that the weather's changing? We got football and all the way there
Yeah,
now in November here.
yeah, no, yeah, things are good. I think, like you mentioned, with the weather shift, definitely a new opportunity for teams to show what they're made of, how injuries and the day-to-day grind of practice and games, and playing on Thursday and then having to have short weeks, and then the Monday night games and all the international games and everything like that, like how all that plays into it. So definitely this is a pretty critical month. Usually this month defines a lot of teams' playoff chances. Also, too, you really see a lot of the rookies, running backs, or receivers that we've drafted fantasy wise actually make moves and do stuff, and you kind of get more data points and you understand the situation better. And it's a really interesting, fascinating time to be a fantasy manager.
Yep, it is. And, just like we've talked all season when we've, hit the record button and start talking. But starting in the off season is, we've started in the off season looking at trying not to look too far ahead and predict the future, although that's exactly what we're trying to do. And now we have 8 points of data to look back and say, as we want to get better and learn from our process from one year to the next of why we make certain decisions. So not looking at this week as a whole, but looking from preseason to now, what are some things that you look when you look back on and you understand the process from the draft to potentially certain waiver wire actions? What are some things you look back on? Get us started here on what are some learning points from this year so
Mm.
far?
Good point. I think a couple. One is at least a mistake that I made, which was looking at an offense and assuming that the wide receiver twos in preseason were worth the price. Prime example would be Jalen Waddle, T. Higgins. Most people would say it's an honest mistake, whatever. But I think looking back on it, burning second and third round picks on those guys, probably not the best use of draft capital. Like obviously, Waddle finished top 10 receiver and Higgins was up there as well. And so you were hoping for similar productivity, but you know, you have to really value those first three or four picks. And if it means boring, stable picks, then fine. It is what it is, right? But I think the lesson I learned, which was sometimes receiver twos are great and they pay off well. Or players that were not even on your radar. Adam Thielen, for example, not even on anybody's
Yeah.
radar, right? And was probably a waiver pick and then turned into this, like he's a top three receiver right now. But at the same time, understanding how the hierarchy of certain teams work with the receivers, and don't try to get too desperate with pulling off receiver twos from big offenses. I also think too is we talked about this several times in the podcast, but seeing a shift of rookies on
Yep.
offenses that I know each year it gets more flexible, more of a committee every single year with running backs, but you see less and less of the Derrick Henrys that you draft in the first or second round and you keep them and you plug and play and put them in every single week. I mean, now you see teams that they'll run some guy out, a veteran out there for 3 or 4 weeks, and the rookie starts kind of taking some snaps, and all of a sudden he commands the backfield. And by week 7 or week 8, someone who you picked up on waivers or was like a 10th or 11th round pick now all of a sudden is getting 20 touches. 21-year-old who's hungry gets lots of touches and all of a sudden is putting up 20 fantasy points a week. So that's another thing too, is something that I'm learning is evaluating rookies and trying to treat them differently than I did 3 or 4 years ago when they would be a stash or like a backup in case of injury. And now you see a lot more rookies get involved with the offenses and a lot more valuable fantasy wise.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point too, because I think something that we get wrong a lot of times in the fantasy community is in drafts we sometimes have a you hit on this, sometimes it's the veteran wide receiver, the veteran running back that it's just I'm going to draft this
Mm-hmm.
guy again. It's the not sexy pick because this isn't the new toy, this isn't the flashy new car, this isn't the whatever of new kid on the block. I'm going to take this guy because oh well he was drafted this high, so he therefore must have
Mm-hmm.
value. And I think you can be right. So I think a situation where you're right on that, where you look at Detroit's backfield and in preseason, Jameer Gibbs, he's the new running back. It's the coaching, like they drafted him in the first round. They traded up to get him. They like had him as that's their guy, and
Mm-hmm.
that sort of news propelled him to a fourth, third, round pick, where it's a very high valuable pick, where you're talking about those have to be very solidified picks. And if you drafted
Mm-hmm.
a player like Jameer Gibbs there, your team's probably hurting a little bit just because of the slow
Mm-hmm.
start. Where we also should have been paying attention to the news of the veteran of the David Montgomery, who was going, 3 or 4 rounds later than Gibbs, to say this is more of a committee that should be closer. And while I say that, and he shouldn't have been drafted that high, I will then turn and not talk out of the other side of my mouth. But he also is a value now because the situation's different. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, understand the situation, and like you talked about understanding how are we valuing players, and is it based on the offense? Is it based on the player? But then
Mm-hmm.
also being willing to change with our perspective on players.
Mm-hmm.
And are we willing to
Yeah.
change fast enough to say, hey, this player still could have value, and this is his
Mm-hmm.
now price tag. So yeah,
Yeah, and
absolutely.
also to kind of piggybacking on that too is when you're drafting, honestly, it's also human to pick something that's easy.
Yep.
So you could look at a player and say, "Oh wow!" Like for example, like 5, 6, 7 years ago, like a Todd Gurley or like a Le'Veon Bell. It's like, all right, I know what I'm getting. I don't have to think about it. I don't have to look and see who's the upcoming rookie or what's going on. Whereas the Lions are a good example, have been the last few years, right, with DeAndre Swift when he was there, right, and like understanding, like, all right, who's trending up, who's trending down, who does the
Yep.
coach like, who like, there's a lot more thought involved. Well, we're human, right? So some people like they don't want to deal with it. They want to say, "Oh, Derrick Henry, I'm," or Austin Eckler, or someone else. Like it's easy, it's easy pick. I'm
Yep.
done. Wash my hands. I can move on to other stuff. But that's where I think a lot of championship teams are made is it's the value, right? It's the same thing. It's like it's finding waiver picks or late round picks that turn into RB4s and fives for the season,
Right.
right? And all of a sudden that propels you from like your team being good to being great. Makes that little cocktail of luck that what happens with fantasy, and all of a sudden, boom, like you win. So that I think is the human nature is to go with comfortable, but reality is fantasy football is changed a lot in the last 5 years with running backs, and that's one area that I think everyone could probably work on is understanding the teams and how each one's different.
Yeah, I mean, gone are the days of the workhorse running back where, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, Bijan was a first rounder or early second rounder if he made it out of the first round. And yet he is still not getting the 20, 25, 30 touches a game. He very well has the play style he could, but that's not the way the offense is running. That's not
Mm-hmm.
the NFL system that we see, where if you do get a running back that is getting 20 touches a game, while on one hand that's a coveted position of having a workhorse back, I think the league is showing us that those are not going to happen as much. We don't play that style
Mm-hmm.
of football anymore. It's a different way. And we talked about this a little bit in the preseason during draft season of understanding who are those valuable targets, but also not having a fear of, well, if I draft this guy, so perfect example is Christian McCaffrey. If I draft
Mm-hmm.
Christian McCaffrey, when is he going to get injured? That was more the talking point of not if, but when will he get injured that I'm going to have to deal with that. And up until this point, it's week 8. Um, he's not injured. He had an injury designation a couple weeks ago, but he's played through that. It hasn't hindered him yet. However, if you drafted a running back like Nick Chubb, where his injury status is a lot less than that of Christian McCaffrey, yes, he's in some drafts, he didn't go in the first round. He could have gone in the second or maybe early third, but he's also now out for an
Mm-hmm.
injury that we're not going to see. So I think something that I think we all can get better at is just not being so afraid of injuries, or at least trying to understand them better. Of understanding that these are players that get put through car crashes every week, multiple
Mm-hmm.
car crashes every week. That if they don't get injured, that's honestly a miracle, just because of how violent the sport is anyway. That we shouldn't just say, well, this guy has an injury risk. Okay, let's just understand that, not use that as an argument. So that's something I want to get better at, is understanding that nuance a little bit. I think there was a fantasy analyst a few years back that did a study of, I think it was either Derrick Henry or Christian McCaffrey one year that they got injured, and it was on the premise of if you drafted that player and then had to deal with the aftermath of them being injured. So you had to find, whether it was off the waiver wire or through a trade, you had to find a player to substitute. And I think it was after like week 8 or 9, you still ended up with more points over the course of the season by having that player, even though you only had
Mm-hmm.
half the production. And of course, this is talking about elite guys. I mean, you're not going to go out and say, well, I get a Damian Pierce, I get Isaiah Pacheco, and I'm much better for it. This is obviously talking about the elite guys, so yes, there's a limit to that. But I think, yeah, we should really understand the narrative so much better than we do. Of it shouldn't just be, well, this guy's injury prone, so therefore I'm not drafting him. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Interesting. Good points. Good points.
but yes, I would agree. I think while on one hand, I do agree with you that yes, I think we can understand, the values of offenses, and I think there's potentially a little bit that has to do with the less prep time that NFL teams get in the preseason, where um, you know we're used to 3 years ago. We'll still be used to the high flying offenses that was there. We want the 41-34 shootout games, and we're not getting that. Um, but at the same time, um, now teams are starting to go into form. So,
Mm-hmm.
when you talk about wide receiver twos or just players on good offenses, I think that's an element that we can draft players, but also understanding. So, using a guy like running back like Joe Mixon last year, he had one game, and I'd have to look up his total stats, but there are still those players where we make the argument of, I think we have to understand the totality of, where they rank
Mm-hmm.
at, hey, for season long, he was RB9, he was, wide receiver 10, they were this. But then we don't break that out game by game and actually look at game by game. We take the averages of, well, per game he did this, versus understanding, was it really an up and down year? And
Mm-hmm.
is there something that changes that? Right. So if something is there that could change that for the positive, that's a buying opportunity of like, hey, I could spend up a little bit more, versus if something changes that to the negative and we see, hey, the production's actually slowing down. I'm going to stay away from paying that price tag on draft day. Maybe we'll see what happens. And there's still maybe buying opportunities as we go. Again, don't hate players. We hate ADPs, or we hate the trade price tag. Where if a player has a really high ADP and we like that player, but it's too high of an ADP, we always say, well, I'm not going to draft him, but doesn't mean I'm not interested in, acquiring him at some point in time of the season. So yes, not stuck on avoiding players at all costs. At least we try not to be over here. So
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think we can fall. That's an easy trap to fall into, especially by week 9, week 10, is looking at averages and saying, "Oh, this is great." Like Taysom Hill, the tight end quarterback combo. Like, man, like his average isn't bad. He's averaging 8, 7 fantasy points a game. This is great. He's a plug and play tight end. When in reality, this will all come last 2 weeks. Right now, going forward, he might be utilized more. But like, yeah, you're right. The averages is definitely a thing. Or understanding that certain players like are they get the touches, but just the production's not happening, and there's a
right.
bunch of other stuff. So I agree with you. I think like it's easy to look at averages and waiver wire, and you filter by running backs averages, and you're looking at points or total points or something like that, and maybe one of those players had a week where they went off for 30 points, they filled in for an injury, and they since then they're at the top of the list. So yeah, I agree there.
And I think so next year, as we look forward to this, and obviously we don't have the full year of data in front of us, but players that come to mind that could do this, both Miami running backs, Raheem Mostert,
Mm,
who he's not been injured yet, but historically and probability will say he probably will be injured at some point in time in the near future. Obviously, not predicting injury. I don't want to hope injury. I hope that doesn't happen. But if we're honest, we're probably leaning he could. But coming off injury, rookie Devon Achane, where before he went down, he was a top 5 running back just on 2 or 3 games that he played. So anything he does after that, after he comes back from IR, he's obviously going to have a high points per game that he played, and also a pretty high season total, where that's good. But what's the risk then? And are we just going to look at the positives and say, well, he's worth a second round, he's worth a third round pick, where we might want to say, well, he probably is worth more of a fourth or fifth round pick, not the
hmm
high of one. Um, and not taking each data point individually versus lumping them all together. So that will be our quest as we end the season. And I know we're not there yet, but as we end the season and think towards next year, of it's good to be thinking about that now, of what are the players like this year that we could be thinking next year, hey, that player did really well. And in reality they did, but there's still a cap here. We have to be understanding of that as well.
hmm
So now, as we think about what we're learning and how we're evaluating going forward, right? There are a couple offenses I think we can draw some, we need to look ahead on, that have some pretty good impacts to fantasy players as we go forward, whether they're players we want to try to trade away while we still have some value, or players that we want to try to trade for, but understand the risk that is involved with some of that value as well, meaning they may be coming off a high, or the situation may be changing enough to where we want players in that situation now, whereas 2 weeks ago we may not have wanted that. Um, so, as we all know, the trade deadline in the NFL has come and gone, and unlike the other sports that happen, baseball, basketball, I don't know if it happens so much in hockey. I'll be honest, I don't pay too much attention in hockey. The trade deadline in the NFL is not very uh, newsworthy most years, right? You know,
hmm
basketball happens. I think that goes to talking through the game, the sport, the way that is run. But we saw a couple names get moved that were pretty noteworthy. One was Minnesota with the loss of Kirk Cousins traded for Josh Dobbs, the
Mm-hmm.
soon to be backup, I think, quarterback for the Arizona Cardinals was the starter. So with that trade and thinking about the playmakers in Minnesota now with Josh Dobbs, maybe not this week, but next week leading the helm. What are your thoughts on Minnesota players? You know,
Mm. Yeah, it's a good point. So I think with Minnesota players, like you got obviously Justin Jefferson. He's been on IR for I think 3 weeks now. I think this is his fourth week, I believe. I need to double check on that. Maybe I'm wrong on that math, but so he's been on IR for a few weeks. You also have like KJ Osborne. You've got Madison. Madison and Cam Akers are kind of like the duo in the running back room. As everyone is probably well aware, the Vikings' running attack is awful. So the interesting kind of wrinkle that happens is okay with Josh Dobbs, like he's getting used to the system and the playbook and everything. Like, are they going to run the ball a bunch? They're probably going to lean on the run more, but then what's going to happen is their offensive line can't make holes for the running back. So what's going to happen? You're going to do HB dives a couple of plays or makes a running play. It's going to be 3rd and 8, and then Josh Dobbs has to make something up where it's going to be like, hey, I need you guys to just run slants, run some outs, just kind of wing it, right? Kind of wing it with the receivers. Now, he's a smart guy, I'm sure, but it takes, I mean, it's a full time job understanding the playbook and knowing the rules and everything for an NFL team. So I think it's going to take a little bit of time just because Kirk Cousins was, I think, a good quarterback. And I think Justin Jefferson really, the routes that Justin Jefferson ran really showed how well he could play football. Justin
right,
Jefferson, he's not having Pat Mahomes thrown to him. It's not Joe Burrow. Like Kirk Cousins is a good quarterback. He's not that tier of quarterback, right? Of like the upper tier, like a Tua or Joe Burrow or someone else. So I think that um, when Jefferson comes back, it's going to be slower. I think you're still going to see activity from Vikings running backs. It's going to be a lot more, I think, 5 to 10 yard receptions versus Jefferson's patented, like, 15, 20 yard
mm,
crazy catches that he makes, more of the deep threats. I mean, just because you have to kind of scheme for that. And I think the quarterback's not going to be as comfortable throwing that ball. Um, and also Josh Dobbs, like he hasn't really had the receiving room at Arizona that he'll get with Jefferson, right? So
right.
that is going to be an adjustment too. Overall, I think if you've got Minnesota players, you got two options. One is on the heels of this Josh Dobbs news, you try to sell your players thinking there's like a high and you can get some good value out of them, or at this point you keep them. Jefferson's on IR probably on your team. Hopefully you probably need him. Obviously, he's your first round pick, but
Right.
hold on to him and give it a couple weeks and Jefferson comes back and you kind of see what happens. So it I think Josh Dobbs definitely helps compared to what was going to happen next week in Minnesota, but it's still going to be a big adjustment for the team.
So if you're, let's say, your team holding Justin Jefferson and he is coming up to his 4th week on IR, so this is his last week that he has to be on IR. So he could be
Mm,
back, and I think they play. I think they play. It's either Atlanta or hold on. Let me look that up here real quick. The Vikings, they play
mm,
New Orleans. They play New
mm,
Orleans his first week eligible back. So if you're a team that needs a win to try to get the playoffs, because let's face it, you lose your first round pick, that's really hard to get. And you have a manager coming to you and he offers for Justin Jefferson this week. So he has one more week on IR. He offers you, let's say, DK Metcalf
mm.
plus some running back, low end running back. Is that a deal you're taking, or is that something
Ooh,
that you're gonna say no? I'm gonna hold steady.
yeah, no, good point. I think it depends on your record. If you, I think, have a winning record, if you are This is about to do week 9. If you are 4-4, I think, or better, you've survived the
Yeah.
hardest part. You survived the long winter, right? So I think you hold on to them at this point. Like you've absorbed, like, think about it from like a math perspective, right? Like you absorbed all the zeros. Like you it only goes up from here, right? It's a parabolic return in terms of your points you're getting from Jefferson. You've endured all of it. So if you're trading Jefferson, his value increases every single week that he gets closer off of IR, right? Because he was worth less at the start, because obviously you get a DK Metcalf,
Right.
plug and play for a few weeks, get the production, but because you've held him, his value is just going to start going up, up, up. So
Yep.
I personally think that you would need more. You'd probably need a little more value if you want to trade him. If you're desperate, I don't know, 2-6, 3-5, right? And your team's not good overall, and you don't think you have a shot at the playoffs unless you make some moves, then yeah, I would try to squeeze a little more out of that trade than probably DK Metcalf and maybe some backup running back. But I think you're right. It depends upon where you are.
Sure.
Desperation plays a part too. Like if you're desperate, you got to make moves. You probably should have moved Jefferson a couple weeks ago, because wins in October are the same as wins in November and December when it's playoff time. Like if you think you're just going to coast through and absorb injuries for a month and not make any moves, well, guess what? You're going to lose 3 of your 4 games, and then all of a sudden your players come back, and it doesn't matter how good your team is, you can't get into that top 4, top 6 for your playoff bracket, and then you're in the losers bracket.
Right. Right. No, and I think that's a good point you make. Of it's dependent. There's not a universal. You must
Mm-hmm.
do this type of trade in order for it to happen. If obviously if you're winning, then yes, so you can kind of weather that storm. If not, and you're still trying to scratch and make that play for just trying to do something, you know, then yeah, I would say you've got to try to make some moves.
Mm-hmm.
So on that though, so let's switch to a player that he's not been injured or not missed a game due to injury yet, but very well could, and he does sit atop his position for. I think he either sits atop the position or he's very close to it. But so if you're rostering Christian McCaffrey, and I know we just talked about don't be scared of injuries when you're drafting, all of this stuff, but given his history, would you be trying to trade him away at this moment?
Mm. Oh man, that's tough.
I'm gonna come with some spicy
I
questions, really hot spicy questions.
Yeah,
That's yeah,
yeah, I agree with you. Oh man, so here's my thought with Christian McCaffrey. My hot take. It's probably not that hot of a take. He's number 1 player in fantasy right now. If you don't have him and you want him, you should go get him,
yep,
because, and the reason why I'm saying this, the 49ers were 5-0 3 weeks ago. Life was good. Life was dandy. Brock Purdy,
yep,
Mr. Irrelevant, lead him to the promised land on his $600,000 a year salary. Life is great, right? They lose 3 games. Most teams, it's like, oh, what's happened? Like my whole team's fallen apart. Like overall, no one has production, right? Like fantasy wise, if your team loses 3 games in a row, typically quarterback, receivers, running backs aren't performing, right? No one is doing well. Christian McCaffrey, not the case. He now has tied the league record for most touchdowns in a row. I think it's 17 games in a row, which is
yep,
crazy. It's nutty. And I'm looking at his stats in a half point PPR league. So in the 3 losses that they've had, he scored 12.7 points, 21 and 26 points. So you have someone who, in one of their worst offensive games, still scores 12 points and he gets a touchdown, 60 yards and a touchdown, basically. So to me, if you got Christian McCaffrey, I don't think you trade him, because I don't know what I don't know right now, unless you need more players to get Christian McCaffrey in like a backup plane, like Christian McCaffrey and Latavius Murray, right, as your running
right,
backs, and
right,
maybe you trade McCaffrey away and get you know, some combination of like a, Madison and a Mostert or something, right? Where it's like some combination where you've got two serviceable guys that helps kind of diversify your running backs. But man, I'm in the boat where I don't think you trade him. I think if you want to better your team, one for one deal, I don't think there's anybody better in the game right now. With his touchdown streak, with also too how Purdy's not playing well, I think Purdy is sensing that, and he's not throwing the ball as far downfield, and so he's with Debo still out too. Like a lot of dump offs are going to McCaffrey and letting him scamper for 10, 15 yards. Like it's a really good fantasy setup that he's in right now.
It is. So if, let's say, you go to the
Yeah.
McCaffrey owner, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you offer him for McCaffrey, let's say you want to do, you're going to have to overpay a little bit, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
he's leading he's leading fantasy scoring. He's on a pretty hot streak. But let's say you're offered, um, let's say you're offered Tony Pollard
Mm.
and Rashi Rice for McCaffrey.
Oh. Okay.
So you're not going to get as good of quality of running back, but it's still a pretty high quality running back, and a potential decent wide receiver that has some good, maybe you're adding some depth there. Is that
Mm.
like is that the type of trade? If you're a McCaffrey owner, you're like, I could make that trade. Now, if you're a McCaffrey owner, your record's probably okay. I'm going to assume that because that's one of the very few first round picks that didn't get injured this year. But
Mm-hmm.
so your record's probably okay. So I don't disagree with you. If I'm a McCaffrey owner, I'm going to keep him. I'm going to ride it out. And if he gets injured, then I'm just going to go down with it and just keep there. But it's an interesting thought process, right? Do you
Mm-hmm.
take a really good trade like that if somebody's like, I really need McCaffrey and this is what I'm giving up for him?
Yeah, I see your point. You I agree with you that if you're trying to take McCaffrey from the owner, you need to overpay. I would think something like Tony Pollard, Keenan Allen is almost who I would go with. Like someone who is top 10 running back, top 10 receiver to make it worth it to lose that production. Because
Okay.
when you're talking about the number one running back, it's not like he's scoring 15 points a game. He's doing 20 plus, right? And
Right.
so both Pollard and Allen, it's like they obviously are both great players, top 10, but like you're gonna have to overpay. Like, and that might seem like a crazy thing to overpay, but that's probably a realistic deal that the McCaffrey owner is considering would be like, all right, I get top 10 receiver with a team that perpetually plays behind. It has a good quarterback throwing to him and is his favorite target. And then Tony Pollard, who is behind Dallas' offensive line. They love to run the ball with a quarterback who's not always the surest at times. Like those are both overall good game scripts, not counting
Right.
the individual games themselves within the game. So if you're the McCaffrey owner or something like that, it's like perfect. This is great. I feel good about this. But anything less than that type of value, I think you are losing out because you have to, when you're taking like someone like that away, you have to overpay. I think.
No, I agree. I think it's so hard to find running backs of that caliber.
Yeah. Yep.
Austin Eckler's just now coming back and hasn't been into form. Tony Pollard's disappointed a little bit, which is where I think
Mm-hmm.
I see your point of if it's Tony Pollard, if I'm the McCaffrey owner, well, he's not done quite as much. So therefore, I want more than just a wide receiver 3. I want more that
Mm-hmm.
wide receiver 1 with him. I want extra production because I'm losing that by losing McCaffrey. So,
Yep.
and
Yep.
that's the hard part of why typically we don't see teams, fantasy teams, that is, trading studs back and forth because the price tags are so high that it's an
Mm-hmm.
inherent value of what production am I losing as well as what am I getting back to try to replace that. So,
Mm-hmm.
but so on a different team, we saw a team start a rookie quarterback this week, and he kind of lit the league on fire a little bit. And that is, of course, Tennessee and their rookie quarterback, Will Levis. kind of injected adrenaline into that offense that we haven't seen for a while. And 2 weeks ago, it was almost sit all your Titans except for Derrick Henry, but we're close to saying sit Derrick Henry. And after 1 week, we actually kind of like DeAndre Hopkins again. We actually are excited again for Derrick Henry. And the only thing that's changed is we've seen one game from a rookie quarterback. So are
Mm-hmm.
you trading for or are you trading away Titans players, specifically Derrick Henry and DeAndre Hopkins?
Mm. I think if you have DeAndre Hopkins, this is a great time to sell if you can do it. I think him coming off a 34-point game, he's a veteran. He's still a very good player, but how often are you going to have a rookie start his first game? I mean, and have four complete drives and three of those go to that receiver. It's just not going to happen. Of course, like totally understand. You want to keep him. You got him. You're desperate. Like I'm holding on for dear life, and this is what I'm doing, and I get it, right? But if you have Hopkins, I think it doesn't really apply to running backs. I think Derrick Henry has his value, and will kind of keep that same value. I think though, if you've got Hopkins, I think you try 100% to sell Hopkins. If you picked up Levis on waiver, if you had the number one priority, or you had extra fab that you wanted to burn, if you picked him up and there's lots of buys happening the next few weeks, selling Levis at this point, saying like, hey, he scored 35 points or 30 points and it's his first game and
Yeah.
he's playing Pittsburgh, who's not traditionally good against the pass right now. So, yeah, I think you sell high on Pittsburgh passing skill players. I think Derrick Henry probably has his same value because Derrick Henry, I don't think it doesn't really change too much other than like really negative game script for him. He kind of gets his carries and his yards per carry, I think, typically.
Yeah. And it'll be interesting to see because Tennessee, the way they're built as far as the NFL team building, if they get a lead, the defense is good enough that they can take some chances and potentially hold the lead. But they haven't had competent quarterback playing to be able to play that style of football. And that's exactly what we saw on
Mm,
Sunday with Levis is an opportunity that got him scores. And then the defense could play with the lead and take those risks and chances. So I would agree. I think I'm more, if I'm holding any Tennessee players, I'm more on the sell because the thought is so drastically different after a few weeks of so negative, where now it's a very positive of I'd rather sell before and take the chance that I'm going to miss out on this production continuing and
mm,
understand that a rookie quarterback has flashes in the pan if they're really good, but they're going to have struggles. Even the great quarterbacks struggled in their rookie year as well. And know that this
mm-hmm,
last half of the year, I don't want to have players where I'm trying to compete for a championship that I can't week in, week out, know this is who I have. So if I have DeAndre
mm,
Hopkins as my wide receiver two, I might be going after, you know, I might be trying to take the risk and saying, can I now take him for like a Jalen Waddle or somebody like that, where it's like, hey, let me sell this big production to say, could I get somebody on a better offense that may have some risk, but the offense is at least a little more sustainable. So yeah, it's again a week by week. What do we do? But you then have to take that into a full season and say, based on a full
yeah.
season, what are we doing? So, but
Yeah, exactly. And that's big is like you have to kind of look at the whole picture. And I think though this is definitely a time where emotional highs or just in general, like looking at stuff and saying, hey, Titans had a rookie come in, all of a sudden, DeAndre Hopkins, everybody loves him. I've known him, I've played him in fantasy for 7 years. Like he scores
yep,
30 points, and then you can sell him to someone who maybe has the same feeling, get some value out of him. Maybe he continues at this, 15 plus points a game. situation, but he probably regresses obviously some, but still you could probably get some value out of him for sure.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's the same risk, those that picked up Puka Nakua after week one in that performance, many skeptics said, well, that's not going to happen again. And it did, but there's been some regression back to it's not the 20 targets a game that Nakua is seeing. It's still a good ad, but for every Puka Nakua call, there's also probably about 7 bad calls of this player's going to do this and just doesn't do it again. So
Mm-hmm.
time will tell. I will err on the side of Pittsburgh. While they've lost some ability at defense, this could be a good opportunity again for Levis. It's also not going to be the best matchup for him coming into Thursday night. So if you're wanting to sell high on the Titans, now is that time. I would agree with you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because like it's really tough because he had a favorable matchup last week. He comes into Pittsburgh, right? They're playing at Pittsburgh. Thursday night's a short week. You know, typically short weeks. It depends upon the team, really, right? But I
Sure.
mean, normally defenses can't scheme as well, right? Usually favors an offense who has like a rhythm that they go into and scheme. But he's also a rookie, first time like having the full weight of like, all right, I'm a starter and I'm doing all this. Like after his performance, he knows what he can do. He wasn't going to disappoint. He might do well, but also too, like he might throw some picks, have some fumbles. Like it's a different environment, right?
Yeah.
So especially Pittsburgh, TJ Watt's going to be chasing him around all day. It'll be a tough game.
Yeah. And you have to go back to his college days because we don't have enough NFL film on him yet. But he was the type of quarterback who took chances. He has a big time arm. He can really throw the ball, but he takes chances, and that sometimes doesn't lead to success. And I think, we're
Mm,
seeing that with other players. Like, we talked about San Francisco a little bit. You mentioned Brock Purdy, where all I think we're seeing the same quarterback, but some of those danger plays that he makes and earlier was not getting penalized for because they weren't turnovers. We're now seeing those turn into turnovers. So it
mm,
can go south pretty fast, but I think we're just going to have to wait and see how this plays out. So, speaking of waiting and seeing how things play out, if you drafted any players off the Cincinnati Bengals, um, you're kind of liking life a little bit better right now after the last few weeks of them playing.
mm,
Um, Despite the slow start, if are you potentially trying to trade for any Cincinnati players, seeing
mm.
the several week resurgence of that offense? Are you trying to trade for him now, or do you think it's too late?
Ah, man. I mean, I think it was a great time to buy Jamar Chase a few weeks ago when he wasn't doing as well.
Yep.
I'm still kind of I'm not super high on Higgins yet, just because I think that he's just a different role of the offense than he has in the past. He's been injured. He's when they weren't as good, he wasn't involved. He wasn't getting the looks and targets. I mean, he caught 5 balls for 70 yards or so, I think, on Sunday versus the 49ers, which has like been almost his best stat line of the season, minus I think for week 2, I think it was. So I'm not high on Higgins. I do like Jamar Chase, kind of going back to that our wide receiver one status where you drafted him and you were hoping he can perform, but I'm not seeing it from Higgins yet in a game
Right.
where the Bengals were completely in control the entire game. Higgins got some looks, but it didn't feel like he's still 100% connected with Burrow. And I don't know if that's just Jamar Chase obviously got tons of looks. So I don't know if that just way Burrow's, reads were. Jamar Chase just open every time, or again, like also Boyd got a touchdown with some other
Yep.
receiving yards too. So, I think T Higgins is kind of flirting with like wide receiver 2/wide receiver 3 on that team. And I think actually I can see Boyd kind of filling the I guess the wide receiver 2 gap where Higgins was. I can see that happening. But yeah, if I'm a fantasy manager, like definitely Bengals, Joe Burrow or Jamar Chase, definitely trying to get those guys. People still can look at their like rankings and say, oh wow, Joe Burrow's like only quarterback number like 10 on the season or ranking
Right.
10, or same with Jamar Chase. So you can definitely get some value from those guys, I think.
Oh, sure. I would actually say because of the ambiguity a little bit of T. Higgins and what his role is, I think that's the perfect buy low opportunity. And
Mm,
I hate to just go and buy low, sell high. That seems like the cliche thing to do for fantasy managers. But Higgins last game he had a 19% target share. So, but he ran
mm-hmm,
on 82% of the routes. So there's definitely some room to grow with what he's doing. So I agree with you. It's kind of it's that risky move of I could still be getting that low end wide receiver 2 production, wide receiver 3 that I have been getting, and that doesn't feel very good. But maybe the trade is DeAndre Hopkins for a T Higgins to say, hey, can I sell high on
mm,
a wide receiver 1 on a team that's in a worse situation from the team that had a spark of life to a underperforming one on a good offense that yes, I'm going down to a wide receiver 2, but I might be able to still turn that around with it and see some better days ahead with that.
mm.
So if I'm uncomfortable with one, maybe I can use that to leverage a little bit more on the other one. So, but yes,
Wow.
I think I I'm not personally going hard after Joe Mixon, but I wasn't high on him coming into the draft. I had kind of a cause for concern because he had a 60 point or it was a 50 some odd point game last year, which really boosted his points per game outing. If you looked at from a season long perspective, a third of his points came in one game. And that was a cause of concern for me of wait a second, am I going to be asking for a little bit of trouble here? And some would say that now's the time to get Joe Mixon, but again, that's where, hey, we can agree to disagree whether we want to go after a player or not. So,
Good point.
but okay, looking ahead, we've been kind of looking ahead a little bit, but this week, I'm assuming there's only two games really that I mean, there's a lot of games. We have some pretty good buys this week, but two games that kind of stick out for most people this week as exciting games. And that, of course, is the battle for the NFC East with the Cowboys and the Eagles. And then we have the game in Munich in the early slot with the faltering Chiefs and the Dolphins.
Mm,
Anything in particular on either of those games as we look ahead and wrap things up here for this week?
yeah. I mean, I you would think Dolphins Chiefs would be a crazy offensive game, but I feel like a lot of times these international games, for whatever reason, it's a low scoring game. And
Yeah,
I don't know if that's the case. I don't know if it's going to be like a 10-7 game. You would think not, based upon just the Dolphins offense. And I think Mahomes is going to be angry and be wanting to play better after they laid the big old fat deuce in Denver last Sunday. But I think that's an interesting game. Like both games are interesting, and from a fantasy perspective, like you can look at it and say the Chiefs defense is better than the Dolphins defense. So you would think maybe the Chiefs can corral Tua and Tyreek a little bit, but I don't think it's going to happen. Um, I think the Chiefs are favored by like 2 points. The spread's like 2 points. It's gonna be a close game.
yep,
Um, it'll be interesting. I guess first thoughts is I think Mahomes rebounds. I think Tyreek still blows up the Chiefs. I think it doesn't matter who the Dolphins have been playing. Tyreek has done whatever he's wanted to, and I think he's going
yep,
to be extra motivated this game. Not that he needs any more, but he's going to be. I mean, obviously left on somewhat good terms, but still, you're playing your old team. Like you wanna put up a 200-yard game. Like you're extra motivated. It's not just another game, right?
right.
So you want to have that 200-yard, two touchdown performance, and flash the little like peace deuces sign at some cornerback as you're running for a touchdown. So I think Tyreek's going to go off. I think it's going to be a close game. My prediction, I think, is going to be. I think it's gonna be a close game. I'm predicting like a 30-24 Chiefs victory. I think it's gonna be close. And then I'll let you kind of talk about Eagles Cowboys.
Yeah, the only other thing I'll add to that is I think on the Chiefs side for the Chiefs and Dolphins, I think the Dolphins still have yet to answer when they face a good defense. What are they like? They didn't do very well against both the Bills and the Eagles. And some have said that the Chiefs haven't played anybody, so their defense is inflated. So we'll definitely see if that's actually the case as well. The only other piece I would say for the Chiefs is I think Isaiah Pacheco has a heyday running because you can run
Mm,
against the Dolphins. So I think that's a kind of the wild card piece that you can have that. Um, and we'll see if a wide receiver steps up for Kansas City. But on to the Cowboys Eagles side. So the biggest question still, the Eagles don't look like the same team that they have been in the last year.
mm,
So with that though, and while they played ugly football for 8 weeks now, really, they haven't really put together a complete game. I think the most complete game was against Miami. They're winning. They're winning the way they need to. They have a good defensive front. They have one of the most highest pressure rated for a defensive front. That's going to play a key role when facing Dallas and not giving Dak a lot of time to throw. When Dak doesn't have a lot of time to throw, he's not as good. He's very human like. He's not as good when he doesn't have that time. So that's going to be the key point right there is can Philadelphia get to Dak and not let him have time to throw? I think it's going to be a close game. I think this one also is going to be a defensive battle that we don't necessarily want to see because at the same time, Dallas also has a good defense. They have better corners, and their linebacking core is really good. And I mean, let's not forget that Micah Parsons on the line, who he wreaks havoc. The difference is Philadelphia has one of the best offensive lines in football. So that is a big key. Um, Jalen's not fully healthy, I don't think, or he's at least not fully right. He's battling something because he hasn't been the same quarterback that he was last year before his shoulder injury. So
mm,
it'll be interesting to see if he has any mistakes. Dallas can capitalize on those mistakes. Um, they finally beat a team that, while the Rams are not blowing the doors off anybody, they're also not a walk in the park. So
mm-hmm,
Dallas can't come out and play inconsistent like they typically do. So I do think the Eagles actually do win this. I say that I'm not very confident on that one. So I
yeah.
think it's more of a 27-23 type game. Very defensive front. Yeah, again, it's low scoring. I don't think we should expect a higher total. So, but again, I wouldn't.
Mm.
It would not surprise me to see Dallas pull off the quote unquote upset on this one. So,
Yeah, I feel like Dallas, like they've had a history of inconsistency the last few years, but it's been really evident this year. I mean, like look at their games, for example, versus the Cowboys, 40-0, Jets 30-10, Cardinals lost 28-16, which is a
yep,
very bad loss. 38-3 Patriots, 42-10 49ers lost, right? And they squeaked out a win versus the Chargers, which I don't think are a very good team. Then they smoked the Rams, right? So like it's either like they either play some of the best football that I've seen
yep,
any team play from a defensive, not so much offense, but from a defense and special teams. Like I think Dallas does one of the best jobs. If they're on, it's crazy. Like they get turnovers, fumbles happen out of thin air, pick sixes, punt returns, kickoff returns, all these shenanigans happen, and they make these holes for other teams they just can't climb out of. They'll play some of the best like non-offensive football I've seen any team play, right?
yeah,
But then Dak will like play mediocre and like they'll still coast to a win, but like they've got to be on for the Eagles. I agree with you. I don't think the Cowboys win, but because the Cowboys have got to come out and play their A game, and on top of that, they have to create some mistakes with the Eagles. So and Jalen Hurts doesn't really make a lot of mistakes, especially now. I think he's a little more timid. He's not throwing the ball as much. He had a good game with AJ Brown Sunday,
Yep.
but he's overall like you're the not from a fantasy perspective not the same quarterback. So I definitely think it'll be an interesting game. I don't know if I feel really good about Dallas or Philadelphia running backs. Like I don't know how I feel about either side.
So I feel like the key for Dallas to win is actually going to get Tony Pollard going. I
Mm-hmm.
think you can run on Philadelphia. You have to have some running lanes, and again, game script has been such where good running backs haven't necessarily been able to produce. Now, James Conner had a great game when Arizona played, so I think you can run. Or I guess that was against Dallas, but I you have there have been good running back plays against Philadelphia. They are a harder matchup, yes, but I feel like for Dallas to actually win this, they have to have control of the ball more. And that's partly then getting Tony Pollard working in the mix there, being a kind of more of a focal point of that offense where you have to wear down those lines and say, we're just going to methodically do this. It
Mm.
can't be a flash in the pan. So, but that's where I think the real football then takes over from then a fantasy perspective where if Pollard's really getting the work, you're gonna hurt CD Lamb where of course we all love CD Lamb and he had an amazing game last week. But on the flip side, for AJ Brown's set the record of 6 straight games for over 100 yards receiving. He's kind of doing his own thing, but DeAndre Swift has been one of the top backs and kind of it not coming out of nowhere, but coming out of a disappointing season, the last 2 seasons in Detroit, then finding something here in Philadelphia and turning it around. I think until he gets hurt, and again, we don't wish or want that for anybody until he gets hurt, he's the lead guy, and it's not going to be a committee back there. And I think we're seeing a little more versatility from Philadelphia with the willingness to go and throw, running back screens or something where they did
Mm.
not do that very much last year. So, again, 2 different types of football, but I think there's going to be a lot of old school, want to control the ball, kind of keep this a little bit lower for Philadelphia and Dallas, which I think will still be a very fun game, but won't be the new high flying offenses that we potentially want to see. So,
Mm. Yeah, good point. Good point.
but all right, well, Grant, it's a pleasure again to be on and look ahead and try to get better at how we deal with fantasy. Any final parting thoughts for before we head into week 9?
Um, Man, it's gonna be a good week of football. Honestly, Chiefs game is gonna be fantastic. Also, don't forget Sunday night football is Bengals Bills. So while their
Yes.
records might not be the best, that's a good storyline. The first game, obviously, since Demar had his incident. So I mean,
Yeah.
going to be a pretty good charged game. So like you're going to have the Chiefs in the morning slot, and then I believe the Cowboys Eagles games at one or my time 125, your time 325, and then
Right. Yep.
the evening game is going to be good. So yeah, it should be a really good day of football. I mean, there's a solid game on for every block. It's gonna be fantastic.
Yeah. Even with a bunch of buys this week, we still have lots of good football.
Mm-hmm.
So be
Yeah, it's
sure
gonna be great.
if you have Dolphins or Chiefs going, um, get those lineups set early
Oh
for
yeah, yep,
the
yep.
for the Munich game. But till then,
Yes, it's gonna be
yeah.
fun for me. I'm gonna be waking up at the game starts at 6:30, so I will be out here. Hopefully, get another 30 minutes before the kids wake up. But we'll see. if I can sneak some maybe the first quarter away on the TV before they wake up. So
Get your coffee out and enjoy a little coffee while
oh
you're
gosh,
watching
yeah,
the game.
100%,
There
100%.
you go. All right. Well, we wish
Awesome.
everyone the best of luck coming up into week 9, and hopefully you are able to manage the bye weeks well and come out this week with yet another victory. And with that, we'll see you all next week.